Israeli protests and Putin-Trump meeting, implications for Ukraine, discussing with David Sharp, military observer. David, hello. Hello, Albina. There are protests in Israel right now over the Israeli authorities' decision to take over the Gaza Strip. Tell us in detail what's going on. There are many aspects to this. They decided to take over the Gaza Strip, but not quite. There are clear restrictions. It is declared to take control of the Gaza Strip in the future, but so far there is an order only to take Gaza City. All of this is militarily uncertain in terms of stretching the plans. As for the protests and oppositions, there are two components. There are relatives of the abducted Israeli hostages, and first of all, they are concerned about the fate of the hostages, because in the course of the escalation of hostilities, the risks for them increase dramatically. This is the first major axiom. There are those who, apart from relatives, believe that the release of the hostages is the main goal, and that defeating Hamas and the strategic goals of the war are secondary. There are those who believe that the release of the 20 hostages is the main goal, and those who believe that the defeat of Hamas and the strategic goals of the war are secondary. Of course, in a situation where the Israeli government declares a desire to take control of Gaza, they are opposed. There are political calculations and struggles with the Israeli government at the level of its political opponents, when any cardinal steps are opposed by definition. Some protest sincerely, others out of principle, which is a normal process. Taking control of Gaza has not yet been achieved, and the plans announced in preparation for the operation to evacuate locals and launch the operation are a long process. It is unclear whether it will be launched and whether it will be completed. The Israeli government leaves open the possibility of a deal with Hamas, which is evident from its actions despite the declaratory decision. Hamas has no desire yet to make a hostage exchange deal with the Israeli government. Hamas wants the Israeli government to abandon the war objective of defeating Hamas, which would mean its fiasco and Hamas's victory. It is still a stalemate, but the Israeli government's declaratory decision has caused a stir within the country and from other states, and so it goes. Israel initially stated that after the Hamas attack, the main goal of the operation against it was to free the hostages. What is known about the fate of the 20 people you have already mentioned? Would an agreement between Israel and Hamas have facilitated their release? Two contradictory goals were stated. According to the Prime Minister, the main goal was to defeat Hamas. It is impossible to say that this is the first goal, because it is in fact the only goal. In warfare, if it is conducted according to certain rules and involves achieving strategic objectives, it cannot be the goal to free 20 hostages or any other number of hostages. This is absurd. If a war is waged with such a goal in mind, things are very bad. The government, embarrassed by protests and press attacks, declared two goals: defeating Hamas and freeing the hostages. These goals were usually used together. Those who wished could interchange them. More recently, after the war with Iran, the head of the government reversed these goals and said that freeing the hostages is now primary, but did not abandon the goal of defeating Hamas. The problem is that in order to preserve the lives of hostages in the fighting, one has to refrain from taking steps that lead to defeating Hamas. Defeating Hamas clearly means taking control of the territory in which Hamas is the authority. There is no other way to defeat Hamas. If we refrain from strikes on places where there may be hostages, victory is out of the question. You can inflict casualties on Hamas, put pressure on it, but there is no victory. Hamas realizes that it will not be starved to death, and if Israel does not go through with the occupation of Gaza, Hamas has no reason to rush to release the hostages, because that is their only bargaining chip. If Hamas has no hostages, Israel has no restrictions on fighting Hamas. Therefore, Hamas demands the release of the hostages and is willing to do so only in exchange for guarantees of inviolability, a complete Israeli withdrawal from all territories, including the borders with Egypt, so that the smuggling of large-scale weaponry is allowed and it can safely prepare for a new attack on Israel. It could be rocket attacks after the rocket industry is rebuilt, or an attack like October 7th. Today it's clear that the Israeli government was trying to pull at least 10 of the 20 hostages as part of a partial deal and promised Hamas a 2-month truce. Hamas was only willing on the condition of a full security guarantee, so that's why things came to a head. Releasing the hostages by force without great risk to their lives is apparently impossible, since the terrorists are willing to kill them in most cases. Today it is known that 20 hostages are alive, but there are no women among them. Many are in poor physical condition and have been starved. Unlike the pseudo-city in Gaza, they were actually starved. A Hamas video of one of the hostages being forced to defiantly dig an alleged grave for himself is eloquent. He is extremely emaciated, and the hand that gives him food can be seen in the footage, and the hand of the starving Hamas fighter guarding the hostage is fat and muscular, unlike the hostage. The situation is very grave, and the display of the hostages in an extremely depleted state has dramatically raised the level of outrage and protest in Israel, including from those for whom the fate of the hostages is a top priority. This viewpoint has a right to exist. In my view, defeating Hamas must be a priority. Otherwise, the lives of hundreds and thousands of people will be at risk for decades to come. In the last 20 years, there have been thousands of deaths and maimings in Israel, rocket attacks all over the country. Are the citizens ready to endure this again in the next 20 years? Everyone must make their own choice. Rubio says that because of Emmanuel Macron's statements that they were going to recognize a Palestinian state unless a peace agreement was reached, negotiations allegedly broke down. How do you see that? Is that really the case? Of course, I cannot say for sure how true this is, but there is no doubt that the European states, and Macron was the first, have decided to recognize a Palestinian state, which of course will not be created. This is just a declarative diplomatic move that will lead to nothing good. That is why Hamas has been given a strong incentive to continue to persevere and not make a deal with Israel. Were they willing to make a partial deal with Israel without Macron's statement? I can't say 100%. They demanded a guarantee of an end to the war and a guarantee of inviolability. Perhaps there would have been progress, but in any case, when they hear that the French or anyone else is willing to give them such a bonus, why rush? It is certainly worth waiting for this and more. In terms of Hamas's pliability, the move by Macron and his like has done nothing good. It has contributed to Hamas stubbornly stubborn in its demands. This is an absolute axiom. It will be seen from here on out. A Hamas leader admitted that the impending recognition of a Palestinian state in September is one of the results of October 7th. So this is a serious incentive. As to September, when the confessions should follow, it is obvious that there is nothing to hurry them until September, whatever they may wish to do. One can only deeply regret the actions of the French. Expectations for Macron in Israel were never high. Everyone realized long ago who he was. You know, I would like your opinion, what Emmanuel Macron is, because now Ukraine depends on European leaders. Volodymyr Zelensky held many talks with Europeans the day before, and Macron was among the first. It can be stated that Macron's position on Ukraine is naturally better than on Israel. But it is difficult to say that France's position is close to optimal. One example is the purchase of weapons by the United States with the money of European countries, where France refused to participate, as far as I understand, on the grounds that it needs to stimulate its own military-industrial complex. Naturally, own interests and the interests of the military-industrial complex always prevail. For any country, its own interests are important. But in this case, the point was that Ukraine, about which Macron talks a lot and tries to help. In many cases, urgent help is needed. If the French had added funding, there could have been more help and it could have been faster. French aid doesn't cover what the United States covers. It's not just a matter of the French paying their MIC instead of buying from the Americans. They can buy other things from their MIC for Ukraine, but what Ukraine needs here and now takes a back seat. I would also like to remind you of the general approach of the French president regarding his possible statements about sending a contingent of armed forces to Ukraine. It was quite a long time ago, but it is indicative that some things are taken seriously after the first throw-in, but then turn out to be empty talk, and in the end these statements and threats do more harm than good, because the enemy, Russia, perfectly understands their value and takes the threats less seriously. In general, my point is that whether Macron or someone else, it is advisable for any leader to distinguish the major from the minor, to be consistent, and to realize that some idle utterances will either do no good or may do damage. Now there is a lot of manipulation on the topic of Putin and Trump meeting in Alaska. They say that allegedly Zelensky may join them. CNN, citing a White House official, reports that any events involving Zelensky in Alaska will only take place after Trump and Putin meet. How do you see this meeting? What can they even talk about? If say, how can they even talk about the war in Ukraine without Ukraine? Unfortunately, life and world history show that leaders of different countries, especially large ones, often try to decide something instead of someone else, or seriously discuss certain issues without consulting the direct participants and leaving them aside. The Americans are using a traditional approach, the same approach that the Soviet Union had. Recently, there have been cases where the Americans started direct negotiations with Hamas without informing Israel. There have also been cases where they have negotiated directly with Iran without informing Israel about issues that concern it directly. My point, that it should not be surprising that world politics and the situation at the level of war and peace is cynical. Unfortunately, this is the reality. However, in the end, the Ukrainians still have a strong position. First, even assuming that the Americans will lean towards a configuration that is extremely unfavorable for Ukraine. Ukraine and Europe, in my opinion, have a compelling case to draw certain red lines even before Trump meets with Putin. I have heard that this has already happened. Secondly, no one is obliging Ukraine to take steps that are radically disadvantageous for it. The problem is that if the Americans consider Ukraine to be at fault on this or that issue, in that case, aid from the United States could be seriously affected, and that's a big problem. That's what Putin can do, by and large. I can only hope that everything happens within the bounds of what is permissible. Trump will hear some of his demands from Putin, but there will be no such plans without the consent of Ukraine and its European partners. I assume that we are not talking about any final decisions that will bring the treaty sharply closer. Most likely Russia's position will be voiced. Perhaps the Americans will present a position agreed with Ukraine and European partners. It is hard to say, but I do not think that what Russia will present will be immediately accepted. Today there is conflicting information about what exactly was offered to Vitkov, but it is worth noting that recently Putin personally demanded as a condition for a ceasefire that Ukrainian troops retreat from Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, except for Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Now, at least if we understand correctly, the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions have been left aside. It's a definite indicator that Putin's position was the upper bar for trade. Now the bar has been lowered. Next, I hope that the United States will show logic in its approach, show the right principles, and not go along with Russia, despite all the current concerns. Very different information now. The Russians are clearly manipulating the terms. Putin, facing Trump's wrath earlier this month, is unlikely to set categorical conditions. Putin is likely to try to have as human a conversation with Trump as possible and butter him up. How do you see the danger now that America may refuse to give any aid to Ukraine, even through NATO, even through Trump's initiative when he suggested the alliance buy weapons for Ukraine?
Даже через НАТО, даже через ту инициативу Трампа, которая была изначально, когда Трамп предложил Альянсу покупать оружие для Украины.
From the beginning of Trump's cadence until relatively recently, Putin was able to relatively cajole Trump and stall for time, including practically meaningless maneuvers, ceasefires for a couple of days, and ceasefire declarations. However, there has been a very tense relationship between Trump and President Zelensky during this time.
Тем не менее, попутно были часть этого времени были очень напряженные отношения между Трампом и президентом Зеленским.
Putin certainly benefited from that. Putin won, largely because of the approach of the United States. He won a few months. However, this scenario, as far as I can see, has run out of steam. When Putin was stalling for time with conversations with Trump or minor initiatives, that has passed. That is why Trump is quite sincere here. No one was pulling Trump's tongue. He expressed his frustration, gave Putin an ultimatum to expire right now with the imposition of sanctions. This forced Putin to take a more far-reaching step beyond simple talk. First, as I understand it, they dropped the demand that Ukraine give up the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions with the right bank, including this, something. It's not a big deal that they gave up on it, but it's something too. What's next? What's next is the meeting, the attempt to charm Trump, to drive a wedge between him and Zelensky. All of that will and is happening. The question is, what can Putin give Trump other than the joy of a face-to-face meeting in Alaska on the 15th? If it's empty words and low-value initiatives, it won't work for the long term. Trump can be put off for a week or two, but if he is sincere about ending the war, the terms Putin has to offer should more or less coincide with American ones. Otherwise, this approach has exhausted itself from Russia's point of view. We will see at the end of the meeting. My guess is that Putin's attempts to drive a wedge between Trump and Zelensky so that Ukraine is helped less or not at all, and Russia is not perceived as the guilty party, is an important strategic goal of his. The question is what he can do to accomplish this. There would have to be substantial proposals to do so, and it's not a given that anything will come of it. As I see it, the chances of Putin charming the US president again and relations with Ukraine and European partners deteriorating dramatically are unlikely. Nothing can be ruled out. Also unlikely is the scenario that the Americans will refuse to sell weapons to Ukraine and NATO countries. Putin will try to come up with something, what he has up his sleeve, and how meaningful it will be to Trump. As I see it, it will be empty proposals of little significance or ultimatums to Ukraine that are obviously unacceptable. I recall that when the United States plan was being discussed, which implied formal recognition of Crimea as Russian territory, but on the other hand a ceasefire and the return of territories in Kharkiv Oblast to Ukraine, U.S. Vice President G. Vance said that Russia's demands for unoccupied territories were unacceptable.
Вице-президент США Венс говорил о том, что требования России получить незахваченные территории, они выглядят неприемлемыми.
The Russians allegedly want Donetsk region, but military analysts note that an important part of the Ukrainian fortifications are there. The Russian side is not talking about peace agreements, but simply about a ceasefire, and it is not yet clear where exactly this ceasefire is.
Не про мирные договоренности разговаривают, они говорят просто про прекращение огня, и еще даже неизвестно, где прекращение огня.
Whether this will be a comprehensive ceasefire or simply a halt to hostilities in the air and at sea, as is favorable to Russia, remains to be seen. The picture is very fuzzy, but there is a danger that Russia will claim the Donetsk region, and specifically Ukrainian fortifications there. What is the crux of this story? Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts were demanded until the last moment. The Kherson region included territories on the right bank of the Ukraine. If the war resumed, it would open the way to Odessa, Nikolaev, and other cities. An important point, the bridgehead on the right bank, which they cannot take by force and which is not on the agenda, they wanted to get as part of the treaty. Today, when a territory is demanded, it cannot refer to a temporary ceasefire. Territory cannot be demanded when there is only a ceasefire in the air and at sea and no strikes are being launched. There have been no cases in the world of anyone giving up territory under such conditions. Theoretically, an exchange of territory is being discussed within the framework of the European initiative, which has been approved by Ukraine. This can only be a condition for a complete ceasefire, that is, a de facto freezing of the situation. I am not talking about a peace agreement. There may not be one, and most likely there will not be. For example, there is no peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula, but there is a de facto situation. Russia, it is important to realize that Putin had far-reaching goals when he started the war. By and large, the plan was to liquidate Ukrainian statehood. History will tell you exactly what they envisioned. Annexing 2/3 of Ukraine, creating a small quasi-state, hoping that Ukraine's western neighbors would grab a part of it and bind themselves to Russia by bloody surety. The liquidation of Ukrainian statehood was de facto planned, and that was clear. Naturally, these objectives had to be abandoned after the de facto defeat of the spring 2022 campaign, but in any case were voiced at the beginning and in the course of the operation of the large-scale Russian attack, what they called the liberation of the Donetsk People's Republic and the capture of the Donetsk region. The capture of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions is one of the few specific geographic objectives of the war. As I understand it, the agglomeration of Konstantinovka, Drushkovka, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk is the most important stronghold and basically the entire Donetsk region. It will be difficult for Putin without presenting Donetsk region, because he started from Donetsk region, and it will be difficult to explain to the militant part of his society that he won on points. So I think the Donetsk Oblast claim is subordinate to that. In terms of being able to continue the war, this agglomeration is certainly Ukraine's most important fortification. If the agglomeration is under Russian control, and then Russia tries to resume the war, even if Russia has transferred some captured territories under Ukrainian control, from a military point of view, it is more favorable to start from that position. But Ukraine has an answer, and if the position of the United States, European partners, and Ukraine is firm enough, the situation will be difficult for Russia. David, thank you for the conversation and analysis. Viewers, please support us with a like and comment, and share where you're watching from. David Sharp, military observer from Israel, was our guest on this stream. Thank you, Albina. All the best.